If I had to identify one virtue Trump may have, is that he's not a warmonger. He's actually quite leery about getting involved in conflict. He would love to get a Nobel Peace Prize. He's not going to get one over Ukraine, right? He's not going to get one over Gaza. So Iran may be his only chance.
President Trump is chipping away at the checks and balances on his power, and he is sending tremors through the international order.
You're gambling with World War III.
How should the world respond? I'm Ken Roth. For 3 decades, I led Human Rights Watch, advocating for civic freedoms, challenging autocrats, and pushing for international justice. On Reframe this week, I'm speaking with Stephen Walt, professor of international affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School and a sharp critic of how the United States has used its power globally. Okay, thank you very much. So this has been an eventful first few months of the Trump administration, a flurry of activity.
To say the least.
We're looking to you to help us understand, is there a rationale behind this? Is there some strategy guiding what he's doing?
I'm not sure I'd say there's a strategy, but there is a worldview behind this. I mean, I think, first of all, this is the most radical presidency I think we've seen in all of American history. And it proceeds from a belief that the existing domestic arrangements in the United States and its international relationships are terrible, are fundamentally flawed, and are, in fact, endangering the country. Right? And what Trump has done is begun to implement a very radical program of, I think, trying to alter almost all of America's domestic institutions in certain fundamental ways, and also transform many of our international relationships. He started to try and do this in his first term, was largely thwarted, but he had 4 years to figure out what he'd done wrong the first time around, and now he feels, I think, vindicated by the re-election, and is basically proceeding to see exactly how much he can get away with.
All right, so let's begin with domestic.
Okay.
What is he doing?
I think the belief is that the United States has been controlled for many years by a liberal deep state that is infested with woke ideology of various kinds and has been led by a series of presidents who didn't check any of this as well. And these institutions have to be fundamentally uprooted. The only way to do that, of course, is with a strong executive, a president that doesn't have to worry very much about laws, norms, checks, balances. And therefore, what Trump wants to do, and I think this appeals to his own ego and appeals to his personality, is remove or weaken all of the checks and balances that might be constraints on executive power. And so far, he has been following the standard autocrat's playbook for how to do that. Now, whether he succeeds is what remains to be seen.
Now, the autocrat's playbook basically is, attacking or neutralizing the Congress, which he's largely done,
right.
Threatening people with primary challenges, even the Republican Party, the judges, journalists, universities.
Every independent source of power has to be gone after. So you have to go after universities because they are independent bastions of thought where people can write what they want, say what they want.
People like you.
Yeah, people like me. You go after the legal profession. You certainly want to politicize Congress. With very rare exceptions, no one in the Republican Party is willing to challenge him because, as you suggest, it threatens their political future if he decides to target them. The business community, of course, has been put on warning that if they are unfriendly to Trump in some way or another, they will not get favorable treatment. Every single independent source of a potential check on executive power has to be intimidated, if at all possible.
Okay. Now, my sense for the first couple months, say, was that there was this deer-in-the-headlight quality to the American people.
Right.
And they were just shocked by this flurry of activity. But that seems to be changing. And what is your sense of kind of where we are right now?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So 2 big things have happened. One is the Trump people made a couple of mistakes. When people tried to accommodate them or appease them, as Columbia University did, as some of these big law firms did, they didn't say, okay, great, and move on. They went back and made more demands, which sent the signal to everybody else that if you tried to accommodate them, it wouldn't work.
The bully is never satisfied.
Bully is never satisfied. So the next victim knew that it wasn't a good idea to go along. Harvard, got where I work, got this letter from the government making a series of completely unreasonable demands, agreed to say no, and immediately began to attract support from other universities as well. The second thing, of course, is the flurry of economic moves they made immediately spooked the stock market, immediately spooked the business community, and spooked the bond market, which even Trump can't manipulate. And that, I think, again, sobered up the administration, at least to an extent, on some aspects of economic policy. So you may see that we've actually hit the point of peak Trump, where the influence starts to decline over time, and I think that's what we have to hope for.
Yeah, I hope that's correct. Let's look globally.
Okay.
Now, again, comparable flurry of activity seems to be breaking every norm, every rule under the sun. Is there a logic here?
I'm not sure I want to call it logic. Or say there's a rationale behind it. And it goes back to what I said earlier, that they believe America's relations with the rest of the world have been fundamentally flawed, that the rest of the world has been ripping us off in a variety of ways, and that American presidents have allowed that to happen. So what the United States has to do is use its power to alter its relations with many countries around the world. Fundamentally change them. And you see this most visibly in this imposition of dramatic tariffs we haven't seen in a century. You've also seen overt hostility towards the European Union. And finally, you see this affection and respect and admiration he seems to have for autocratic leaders. He's much more comfortable with the Putins, Xi Jinpings, Mohammed bin Salmans, Erdogans, Orbans of the world.
He wishes he could govern like them.
He wishes he could govern like them. He respects them as strong men, and notice they're almost all men.
And they last a long time.
They last a long time. They're able to do what they want. And in his mind, the perfect world is a world where people like him get together with people like them and make deals. They don't have to worry about legislators. They don't have to worry about laws. And that is his vision of a sort of autocratic concert of kingpins that would run the world.
So if you have these spheres of influence where coercion is what matters,
right,
is that a smart strategy for the United States?
It's an incredibly short-sighted strategy for a variety of reasons. First of all, a world where you endorse that kind of revisionism means lots of other countries will start pushing to change the status quo, and that creates all sorts of unpredictable problems that the United States would then have to start worrying about. But even more importantly, he's worsening America's relations with some of our closest friends. I mean, no smart strategist would pick a fight with Canada. The most pro-American country probably in all of Europe is Denmark, and he has picked a fight with Denmark because he'd like to take over Greenland. Finally, because Trump thinks unpredictability is such a virtue, it enhances your bargaining power if nobody knows quite what you're going to do. What he doesn't realize is over time, nobody wants to deal with someone whose word can't be trusted because they won't be sure what the United States is going to do. That's not in America's interest, and it ultimately makes it harder to manage the world.
Now, let me ask you this. I mean, is Trump completely novel here, or are there elements of the U.S. foreign policy historically that Trump is replicating?
Well, the United States has always had an isolationist current, right, going back. Even Bill Clinton, when he was president, told one of his aides that, Americans are deep down fundamentally isolationist. And it's a function of our history, and it's a function of our geographic position. But for the most part, we treated our allies with a certain degree of respect, with a certain degree of deference. We embraced multilateralism as a way of making our leadership more palatable and acceptable to others. And Trump is tearing that up now and saying it's simply power alone that matters. It's what you're going to do for me if you want me to do something for you. And ultimately, I think that's very short-sighted.
Where I see more of a commonality, and I'm curious what you think, is the traditional U.S. skepticism about international law, where international law was for the other guys.
Yes and no. I mean, that strand has always been there, that concern, and certainly on the American right, this concern that international institutions were simply ways of tying up the United States in various ways. And certainly no one should be under any illusions that, American presidents from Barack Obama to Donald Trump to George Bush, Bill Clinton, were going to do what they thought was in America's interest when they really had to, but they didn't want to brag about it in quite the same way that this administration does, and they understood that international law was, in fact, a useful tool that most of the time was something that actually worked in America's favor, not against us.
Right. Let me, if I could, move to Israel-Palestine, something you've written about, you know, very well. As I look at Trump's view of Gaza, I mean, beyond just being criminal, just ethically cleanse 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, but he seems, mostly to be just giving the green light to Netanyahu to humor his worst instincts. But then every once in a while, he'll say no to Netanyahu. Right. And I'm curious kind of where you see that relationship.
Well, on Gaza, of course, Trump's policy is not all that different, ultimately, from what the Biden administration's policy, which I think was also irresponsible, in that they were not happy with what Israel was doing, but they never used any of America's leverage to actually alter what Israel was doing with Gaza. Trump, of course, has done nothing.
So Trump doesn't even say don't do it. Yeah, Biden said don't do it, right. But he kept arming them.
If I had to identify one virtue Trump may have, however, is that he's not a warmonger. He's actually quite leery about getting involved in conflicts. He was very critical of the forever wars earlier. And he apparently has pushed back when Netanyahu and Israelis have said, we really got to do something about Iran. We've got to use force. And he has resisted that as well. He briefly bombed the Houthis. When it was clear that wasn't working, he stopped and said he
declared victory.
Declared victory without having really achieved one, but that's what politicians do. And first of all, unlike Biden, I don't think he has any affection one way or the other for other foreign countries, including Israel.
Yeah. Right. He has affection for himself.
He has affection for himself. Yeah. And I think he also is listening very carefully to other voices in that part of the world. He listens to the Saudis. He listens to the Qataris. He was listening to them even before they gave him a plane. He listens to other Gulf states as well. And what he's hearing from them, of course, is what's happening in Gaza is a real problem for us. And you need to do more about it. You certainly shouldn't be supporting it. So I think there is some possibility that what Netanyahu may have thought was going to be a very close relationship. I think that relationship may turn out to be much more delicate than we thought.
And we've seen Trump, able to say no to Netanyahu. He insisted on the temporary ceasefire that began at the end of January. He's insisted we're not going to bomb Iran. We're going to negotiate with them. What I'm wondering is, given Trump's interest in the Nobel Peace Prize, given his, interest in kind of a big Middle East peace deal, is there any chance that Trump would arm twist Netanyahu into agreeing to a Palestinian state?
I think he might try, but he won't succeed. I can't imagine the circumstances under which Netanyahu, who has devoted most of his political career to opposing the creation, he would ever agree, or that Trump would be willing to put the kind of pressure upon him that might lead him to do that. So I don't think he'll do that. And remember, Trump is not a details guy. He likes to come up with big, lofty plans, announce them, and then when they don't work out, it's somebody else's fault. And the person he's made his envoy for that and also for Ukraine is a real estate guy who's not going to be able to pull that off as well. They are now trying, I think, making some Israelis nervous to negotiate a new nuclear package with Iran. Again, suggests he doesn't really want to get into a war with Iran. I think you're absolutely right. He would love to get a Nobel Peace Prize. He's not going to get one over Ukraine. Right? He's not going to get one over Gaza. He's not going to get one over Greenland. So Iran may be his only chance.
Okay. I think it's time to turn to the audience.
Oh, great.
We have some good questions here.
I'd like to ask a question related to your 2007 book, The Israel Lobby. And given what we've seen over the last 18 months with America supporting Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, do you feel vindicated in your book? And if you were to rewrite it, update it now, what key themes would you take from American politics over the last 18 years to discuss this relationship with Israel now?
I think we do feel vindicated in that much of what we argued has been shown to be true, and long before even what happened in Gaza. Barack Obama genuinely believed in trying to bring a two-state solution about, worked fairly hard at it, and basically got nowhere. And for the same reasons we identified in our book, it was thwarted by the political opposition of the Israel lobby in the United States more than anything else. And I believe that played a non-trivial role in how the Biden administration responded to Gaza as well. I don't think they were happy with what happened in either the Hamas attack, which they rightly condemned, or the Israeli response, which they criticized but refused to do anything. And I said at one point during the beginnings of the conflict that if you don't want somebody to do something, you don't provide them with the means to do it. So the Biden administration was criticizing what Israel was doing with the military equipment that we were sending them, and we continued to send them. And I think that, again, some of that reflected the president's own ambivalence, his strong feelings for Israel, but I think it also reflected political calculations that they were making, especially in an election year.
Yeah, and this Israel lobby that you wrote about, has it changed over the years?
It's changed in some respects. It's a somewhat more diverse arrangement. I think that one of the things that is different now is that public attitudes in the United States have shifted. If you look at opinion within the Democratic Party, that has shifted significantly. Popularity of Israel, unconditional support, no longer nearly as popular within the Democratic Party. And it will be interesting to see, apropos our earlier conversation, if Trump's friction with Netanyahu over time begins to affect how the Republican Party thinks about it, because Likud and Netanyahu bet very heavily on the Republicans. They were going to be our principal backers, and that may ultimately backfire on them. Unfortunately, it hasn't affected the basic character of American policy towards Israel, which is still one of largely unconditional support.
Okay, we'll take another question from the audience.
Given America's retrenchment from its role as global policeman and maybe its move to the dark side, what's Plan B in terms of establishing a future global security framework?
You don't want to overstate America's retreat from being a global policeman, right? So they may gradually be doing less in Europe, for example, and reduce the American security presence there. Our security presence in the Middle East is about what it's been for the last decade or more, and we're increasing our presence in Asia, largely in response to the rise of China. So the United States is going to remain involved in lots of global security projects, some of them, I think, probably positively, in other cases, probably negatively. But we're not in retreat, at least not yet. If the United States, you mentioned going to the dark side, if what we're doing is trying to divide up the world between China, Russia, India, maybe some other countries in the Middle East, and then manage it along with them in a kind of great power condominium, I think that's not going to work out particularly well, and particularly if the United States is not seen as a particularly reliable partner for those other countries. So, how much of that shift actually happens, we don't know yet. But again, I mostly would push back on the idea that we've gotten out of the global security business. It's mostly obvious with respect to Europe, but not the rest of the world.
Okay. Another question.
One might infer from your comments that politicians have failed to thwart Trump, both domestic politicians and global. So what about we the people? What role is there for citizenry, both in the U.S. and globally, to act in that capacity to thwart some of the things you've been talking about?
That's a great question. So in a situation like this, one of the most effective things is, in fact, nonviolent civil disobedience. And you've seen that happen in a number of countries where you have sort of autocratic takeovers in progress that then get thwarted by citizens out in the streets, by general strikes, by all sorts of, again, nonviolent ways of suggesting no. You're seeing parts of that start to happen in the United States, demonstrations increasing in a variety of ways. And if some of Trump's policies starts to have real negative consequences for the United States, that's going to grow. So I think there are prospects for not only within the normal channels, organizing campaigns, trying to get good people elected, trying to drive people who have been supporting Trump in an unconditional way out of office, all of the usual stuff. But there is a role, I think, for public displays, public anger, public resistance as well. One thing I do worry about is that this is an administration that may be looking for opportunities to crack down in various ways. That if some of the resistance to Trump, turns violent, gets out of control, then this is, I think, an administration that would love to be able to exploit that. In his first term, Trump invoked emergency powers 13 times. To justify various actions he was taking. He has done so 8 times in 3 months. So that suggests that they are ready, right? And again, one of his key tactics, I forgot to mention it, is appointing loyalists to all these key positions. Not people who are necessarily competent, but people who are personally loyal to him rather than to the Constitution. And Trump himself, when asked recently if his job was to uphold the Constitution, said, "I don't know."
You got to ask the lawyers.
Yeah, I've got to ask the lawyers, which tells you something. I might add, Rolling Stone magazine then called all 53 Republican Senate offices to ask for a reaction, and none of them responded, which gives you a sense of how serious the problem is now.
Okay, I think we have one more question from the audience.
So do you think Trump is being naive in his approach to Russia regarding Ukraine?
So he was certainly naive to say in the campaign that he could solve this in 24 hours. As Putin and others have discovered, it's much easier to start wars than it is to stop them. Secondly, his approach that you could solve the problem by putting all the blame on Ukraine and putting no pressure at all on Moscow, I think was also naive. And finally, to link some degree of American support to Ukraine signing a deal for access to minerals is not a good look for the United States.
Stephen, if I could, I agree with you. This was embarrassing extortion. Right. But is Trump coming to appreciate that this is not just a battle over land, that for Putin, what this really is about is crushing Ukraine's democracy so it no longer serves as a model for the Russian people?
I think it's partly it. I also think that what Trump may have understood at some sort of loose level is that the war did arise partly out of not just those concerns, which I think were there, but also Russia's security concerns about Ukraine eventually joining NATO, NATO possibly stationing forces in Ukraine. And from a Russian point of view, this looked like an existential threat.
But if I could challenge you on that, because this invitation to Ukraine to join NATO did not spark an invasion. What sparked the invasion was in 2014 when the Kremlin pawn, Yanukovych, was overthrown and Ukraine emerged as a more vibrant democracy. That was the moment then the initial invasion started.
I believe in Putin's mind, this was, in a sense, a preventive war designed to prevent Ukraine from becoming so strong that Russia couldn't deal with it in the future. I don't need to tell you this. Preventive war is illegal in international law, right? So it's not a justification, but given the enormous damage that Ukraine has suffered as a result of this, we should have thought more carefully about the road we were on going way back, 15, 20 years or so.
So let me ask a final question, Stephen.
Sure.
There obviously has been enormous damage done to America's stature in the last few months. Is this redeemable, or is this now a permanent feature of Washington's standing in the world?
I hope it is not a permanent feature, and I worry that it is, in fact, going to have lasting effects. It's going to be much more difficult for the United States to restore its reputation after Trump 2 than Trump 1. Trump 1, the rest of the world could treat it as an aberration, silly mistake America make. They wouldn't repeat that again, right? Well, then we did. So I think several things have to happen. One is a future administration that wants to rebuild ties has to be willing to admit that we've made some mistakes here. And that's not something American presidents are very good at doing. Second, I think when we start to reach out to others, we should be trying to negotiate deals that are good for them, but are also good for us, because others will believe that we'll keep our word if they understand that the arrangement is something that's actually in our interest. But most importantly, and this is actually worrisome, most importantly, the people who did this have to be held accountable, not punished for policy disagreements. But if crimes are being committed by members of the Trump administration, they have to be held accountable in ways that we have traditionally not done in the United States. We didn't hold people accountable for torture under the Bush administration, for example. Right. And the problem is, so there's this paradox. If you want to be able to rebuild America's reputation, you have to hold people accountable for mistakes you've made in the past and for crimes that were committed. But if you're going to do that, they may try to hang on to power even if they don't have any legitimacy.
And the Supreme Court may have solved this by making criminal prosecution of Trump all but impossible.
All but impossible for Trump as an individual, but not for other members of his administration, right? Not for possibly, you know, his son or whatever. And that's the thing you worry about.
Okay. Stephen Walt, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us as well and contributing your questions.
Thanks very much. Pleasure.
Thank you.